Hey folks, how's it going? Realm Gaming here, back into the video. Today's episode, we are going over Demonology Warlock and Cataclysm Classic. One thing to note, I do have some socials over here in the top left-hand corner if you want to check those out. I did also just start a Patreon. If you want to try and support the channel, feel free to. We also have a Twitch. We're starting to stream a little bit on Twitch, and a Discord if you want to check those out. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into some of the pros. So first pro is we have great AOE and we also have great single target damage. Now you will see a little bit later in the guide, we do have to earn our damage. It's a pretty complex rotation. There's a lot of things you have to prepare for before the opener and on pool. But if you can pull that off, we do have great damage. We also get Demonic Pact, and this is a buff to the raid. It's going to buff, you can kind of see over here on the right hand side, the raid spell power by 10%, and this is also going to increase your individual spell damage by 2%. We have an extremely strong cooldown called Metamorphosis, and this is going to turn you into a demon, and you're going to be able to do a whole bunch of cool damage. And AoE during it is on a pretty long cooldown, so you're not going to be able to have it up constantly, but most of your burst will revolve around Metamorphosis. And we also have just a ton of utility, and that's kind of why I have all these little screenshots on the screen here. This is all the utility. There's actually even more than this. I wasn't able to include everything, but this is most of the utility that Demolock brings. So you see we got Curse of Elements over here on the right-hand side. We've got Health Stones, Soul Wells. We can banish mobs. We bring Fell Intelligence as well. So Fell Intelligence, if you're not familiar with it, it's going to increase the mana of your raid and make them regenerate more mana per 5 seconds. We have Soul Stone, which is turned into a battle res as well. We have our Lock Closet, Ritual of Summoning, and we also have a Dark Intent. Dark Intent, if you're not familiar with it, you basically link up with another target, and when you critical strike, they get a buff, and when they critical strike, you get a buff in return as well. Now, some of the cons of Demolock is we don't have a ton of mobility, and you do have to hardcast a lot of spells. Kind of like we were talking about earlier, the rotation is pretty complex, especially pre-pull and on the opener. Once you actually get into the core rotation, it's not that bad, but there's a lot of boxes you have to check to be able to do optimal DPS. Another con is you are running around with a pet, and everybody knows that pets are a headache to deal with most of the time, whether that's pathing, whether that's them just listening to your commands, whether that's them dying, them bugging out. There's a lot of issues with pets just in WoW's history in general. So in my opinion, I would consider it a con. And the very last point just kind of stems off that the pet AI can have some issues. Okay, moving on to stats. So intellect and spell power. So intellect did change actually. Intellect now gives spell power at a 1-to-1 ratio in Cataclysm. So the more intellect you have, now the more spell power you have. Next we have hit rating. So you want to get your hit rating to 17%. So make sure you're sitting at 17%. You don't want to be at 18 or 19%. It's pretty much a wasted stat over 17. And if you do go over, just make sure you're reforging into one of these other stats down here. So we also have haste rating, which is going to be really strong for us. It's very strong for most specs, most DPS specs, especially if you're using dots. So we use Corruption, Immolate, and Shadow Flame. And you can see here, the more and more haste you get, the more ticks you can get out of these spells. Now, the kind of tricky thing about haste is you don't ever want to be in between these ticks here. So at 7.2% haste, we get 1 extra tick. That's great. But if for whatever reason you're sitting at, let's say like 15% haste, what you want to do is you want to reforge your haste and go back down to 7.2% haste, because anything over 7.2 in that case would be wasted haste because you're not getting that second tick. So the only time you want to be focusing on haste if you're able to get to that next tick for your dots. Now, the example that I just gave might not have been the best example, right? Because at 15% haste, you would have gotten an extra tick of Corruption, and you've been very close actually to an extra tick of Shadow Flame. So just know that these are hard percentages, and you don't want to be in between any of these ticks on these different spells. Then, of course, Mastery Rating is a new stat in Cataclysm, so this will actually be stronger than Critical Strike for us. Even though that dots can Critical Strike now, Mastery Rating is still going to outscale it. So our Mastery is very straightforward. It basically buffs our demon's damage, and it buffs our damage while we're in Metamorphosis. All right, Bane of Doom and Bane of Agony. These are no longer curses, which is really good for us because this means that we can have one of these two curses up at the same time as Curse of Elements. Another thing that's really cool is Soul Shards no longer take up any bag space, so that's really awesome. we do also get a Battle Res now, which is really nice through Soulstone. So Warlock's already brought an insane amount of utility, so this is kind of just the cherry on top. Demonic Pact here at the bottom now just gives a flat 10% spell power, and this no longer scales off of our spell power. Then here at the very bottom, we did have an overhaul to Metamorphosis, and we will dive into that a little bit later into the guide. Okay, so before we even get into the rotation here, I know it looks pretty daunting, but we're going to try and simplify it a bit. So first things first, you should be aware of is mastery swapping and pet twisting. So for mastery swapping, Metamorphosis basically snaps your mastery stat at activation. So this means that you're going to be able to retain your mastery throughout the duration of Metamorphosis. So we can actually exploit this, and what we can do is keep a high mastery gear set on hand, swap to it right before we metamorphose, and we will retain all that mastery while we're in Metamorphosis. Therefore, we can equip our old gear back with all the good stats on it and also get the buff from the master gear. So there are various add-ons, and I think there's something in game that you can use the gear manager to kind of swap gear quickly back and forth. But this will be a very noticeable DPS gain, so this is something that you probably want to do. So when we get into the rotation, we'll kind of talk about how to do all that. But for now, just so that you're aware of what it is. Then the next item I want to talk about was pet twisting. So throughout the fight, we're going to be using our Fell Hunter because it does the most raw DPS. However, through our Demon Soul cooldown, it does not give the best stats. So you can see Demon Soul up here in the top right. So for our Felguard and Fell Hunter, Felguard is going to give us spell haste and fire and shadow damage increase. And our Fell Hunter is only going to give us periodic shadow damage increase by 20%. So the Felguard actually has a better buff through Demon Soul. So basically what we're going to be doing is anytime that our Demon Soul is off cooldown, we're going to be swapping to our Felguard. We're going to pop Demon Soul, and then we're going to swap back to our Fell Hunter. Okay, so hopefully I didn't lose you already, but those are two things that are pretty core to our single target rotation. So I just want to make sure before we dive into any of this that you are aware of what those are. So let's try to simplify this a little bit, right? Steps 1 through 8, these are all pre-pull. So this isn't even really a part of your in combat rotation. This is all pre-pull stuff that you're going to make sure you're doing to prep the pull. So step 1, make sure your master gear is on. And step 2, you're going to make sure you have the correct pet out. And then step 3, you're going to make sure your Fell Armor and Soul Link are on. Step 4, you're going to make sure that you're staying within melee-ish range of the boss for your Immolation and your Immolation Aura and Shadow Flame. You can also Soul Burn pre-pull. That's going to save you a global for whenever you need it to summon your next pet. Step 6, we're going to be casting Metamorphosis with about 2 seconds left on pull timer. We'll talk about that a little bit later while we're doing that. And remember, when we do pop Metamorphosis, this is where we're snapping that mastery. We're going to snapshot the mastery, and you're going to be swapping to your normal gear after you do get into Metamorphosis. So that's step 7. I kind of get ahead of myself. Step 8, you're going to want to pre-pot your Volcanic Potion unless your raid is lusting, and then you want to hold on to it if that's being coordinated. And then step 9 here, this is why we're popping Metamorphosis 2 seconds before pull timer, or with 2 seconds left on the pull timer, so that we can cast the Shadow Bolt, and the Shadow Bolt can land instantly as we pull boss. Optional here, Curse of the Elements. Obviously, somebody in the raid has to keep it up. If it's your job, make sure you're doing it. Step 11 is going to be our Demon Soul. And then step 12 is where we're going to pet swap to our Fell Hunter. Step 13, we're going to keep our Bane of Doom up. Step 14, pop anything you have, like any trinkets or anything that's just going to kind of buff your damage. That's going to be step 14. And then step 15 is Summon Doomguard. Now, one thing I will say with this is on a pretty long cooldown, so I would try to save Doomguard for whenever your raid is lusting. So let's just recap for a second, because we just kind of talked about a lot. So steps 1 through 8 is pre-pull, and then steps 9 through 15 is pretty much going to be your opener. I guess you could say 16, but the middle chunk is going to be your opener, and then everything else is pre-pull. Now, the good thing about this is steps 16 through 24 is pretty much going to be your core rotation here. The only thing that's not really listed here is The Metamorphosis, right? Whenever we are mastery swapping, and that's not built into this down here at the bottom. And then whenever we want a pet twist, that's not built into this. So those are the two things you'll have to kind of remember is whenever Demon Soul comes up, pet twist. Whenever Metamorphosis comes up, swap your gear. So anyways, back into the core rotation, Hand of Golden. You're going to keep that on cooldown at all times. Step 17, Immolate. 18, Corruption. You're going to keep these dots up at all times. You can also Demon Leap to position yourself around the boss. You know, that kind of goes hand in hand. If we go back to step 4 here, the Immolation R and Shadow Flame, you want to make sure that you're staying within melee range of the boss. Our filler is going to be Shadow Bolt. And then we are going to cast Incinerate 3 times whenever we get a Molten Core proc. So we've not covered Molten Core yet. It's over here on the right-hand side. You have a 2% chance to gain the Molten Core effect when your Immolate deals damage. The Molten Core effect empowers your next 3 Incinerate spell casts within 15 seconds, increase the damage done by 6%, reducing cast time by 10%. So when you get 3 stacks of Molten Core, again, we're going to use 3 Incinerates. And then down here at the very bottom, whenever the boss does get into execute range, we're going to be using Soulfire. So this means Soulfire will become our filler and no longer Shadow Bolt. And then from here, you know, just continue to keep your dots up and Incinerate whenever Molten Core procs. Now, thankfully, the AOE rotation is quite a bit more simple. Basically, what you're going to be doing is you want to make sure, of course, you have your Summon Felguard up. He will do more AOE damage. From here, you can Hand of Gul'dan. You can Fellstorm, Metamorphosis, Demon Leap to stay within that melee range, and then you can Hellfire. And the cool thing about Hellfire is you can actually move around with Hellfire while it's channeling due to talents. So thankfully, the AOE rotation is not quite as crazy as the single target. Okay, and then for our talents, we're going to be putting 31 points into the Demonology tree. So this is going to put us into some key talents like Inferno, Metamorphosis, Hand of Gul'dan, and even Molten Core. So we want to be very deep into the Demo tree, and then our final 10 points are going to go into the Destruction tree. And the points here are mainly going to be buffing our Shadow Bolt, Immolate, Soulfire, and Incinerate. So feel free to pause the video here if you can try to copy some of these talents over. Then for our glyphs here, we're going to be running Glyph of Metamorphosis. So this is going to increase the duration of Metamorphosis by 6 seconds. This is our main cooldown, so of course that's very nice to have. We also have Glyph of Immolate. This is just simply going to buff the damage of Immolate by 10%. And then finally Glyph of Incinerate. This is just going to increase the damage of Incinerate by 5%. For major glyphs, we have Glyph of Life Tap. And this is basically going to reduce the global cooldown of Life Tap. And then we also take Glyph of Shadow Bolt, which is going to reduce its mana cost. And then the 5th glyph here is optional. You can run Glyph of Soulstone. This is going to increase the health by someone being resurrected by the battle res by 70%. You could also run Glyph of Soul Link as well, which is going to increase the damage shared with your demon when using Soul Link by 5%. So this slot is optional. Then finally, minor glyphs down here at the bottom. Again, all completely optional, just kind of whatever you want to do. We got Glyph of Drained Soul here. That's going to regenerate some mana after you kill mobs. Glyph of Ritual of Soul, which is going to reduce the mana cost of this spell. And then Glyph of Unending Breath. This is going to increase your swim speed. Okay, then here's the list of gems and enchants we'll be using. On the enchantment side of things, you can kind of see a lot of items that are for specific professions. So for example, we have the Lightweave Embroidery. If you're not tailoring, then of course just go to the next item in the list. In this case, it'll be the Enchant Cloak Greater Intellect. One thing to note down here at the very bottom, make sure that you are meeting your meta gem socket requirements of at least 3 gems of the correct color. So since we're going Shadow Spirit Diamond, that's going to be 3 red gems. And honestly, that works out perfectly because red gems is what we're going for. The Brilliant Inferno Ruby is what you're going to want to be filling those red sockets with. For yellow sockets, we're going Ember Topaz, or a Quick Amber Jewel. And then for blue, the Veiled Demon's Eye or Rigid Ocean Sapphire. So for the most part, we're looking for Intellect, Haste, and Hit gems. Then finally for consumables, you'll be running the Flask of Draconic Mind. This is going to give us 300 intellect for an hour. Our food buff, of course, if you don't have a feast, is going to be the Sagefish Head or the Grilled Dragon. One thing I did not include on this list here is the Fated Fortune Cookies that will also give 90 intellect and 90 stamina. So just depending on auction house prices, you can pick one or the other. Then of course we'll be running Volcanic Potion, which you can pair with your Summon Doomguard, which is very important because Summon Doomguard does snapshot your current intellect. So you want to get as much intellect as you possibly can. And then you also can pair this with your Raid Lust. So that way you're just getting the most value out of this as you possibly can. All right, guys, that's going to be the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Again, in the top left, we do have a Discord, a Twitch, and a Patreon if you want to help support the channel. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you on the next one.